So let's start off with this intro, which we've done a little bit already of, but let's iron it out. An offer, not the contract, an offer may be terminated any time after the offer is made and up until the offer is accepted. If an offer is properly terminated, the offeree no longer has the power to accept or the power of acceptance to accept the offer. So ultimately, if an offer is terminated, no contract is formed unless a new offer was made. An offer may be terminated by lapse, operation of law, revocation, or rejection. Okay. Really quickly, let's look at our termination 101 hypo. Just to get us warmed up with termination. Let's go with Shelby on this. I'll read it out. DeAndre is a private tutor and asks Carly, a student, if she'd like to sign up for his bar prep program for $3,000. Carly responds yes. DeAndre then changes his mind and says, you know what? Never mind. I don't want to work with you. Is a contract formed, Shelby?
I think the contract was formed.
If you're gonna sin boldly. Take out that think. And what's your answer? Contract was formed. What's the order of operation here, Shelby?
Because
Nope. Order of operation. The first thing that we had was an offer. Then what happened next?
She accepted by saying yes.
Carly, she accepted. There was an acceptance that will likely be valid. And then what happened after the valid acceptance?
He tried to terminate.
Right? There was an attempted termination. But guess what? We know the foundation and the basics already. And we know that if there's a valid acceptance, there's no longer the ability to terminate. So again, even though DeAndre tried to do that, we cannot give that weight. There is no effect of that attempted termination. So ultimately, you have an offer and acceptance, assuming there is consideration, then a valid contract is formed. Okay, so if you look at number 2, instead, right, DeAndre is a private tutor and asks Carly, a student, if she'd like to sign up. DeAndre then changes his mind and says, I don't want to work with you. Carly then responds, too late, I accept that offer. Right, so very similar fact pattern, but what did we do? We switched the order of these. Here, under hypo number 2, the termination came first and then the acceptance. But we know if there was a valid termination, then Shelby, there cannot then be a valid. Exactly. Right? So again, these are all simple ones to get us going. It's going to get complicated. I'm prepping you now. But as we see, it's very simple and it'll be easy once we understand the basics. It's all about order of operation. And it's about not just gravitating towards a person's statement and assuming it's valid. Some of us might see, oh, DeAndre changed his mind and said he didn't want to do it anymore. So that must have been revocation. Well, no, considering the timing, it's not going to be effective. All right, so let's go back to our blueprint now and let's start learning each of these different ways to properly terminate. Because that, as you guys can now see, is going to be the more difficult thing. Seeing the timing in the chronological order, okay, sure, that's easy. You just follow the fact pattern. But you have to quickly analyze if each one is valid. And so here are how you determine valid termination, right, is by going through these rules. You can only do it by one of 4 ways. The first way is lapse. An offer may be terminated if the offeree fails to accept within 1, the time frame stated in the offer, or 2, if the offer is silent, then within a reasonable amount of time. So that could be simple, right? The first example is pretty straightforward. I offer Shelby to sell you my seashells, right? And you must accept by Friday because I'm leaving for Jamaica by then, right? So then you try to accept on Saturday. That acceptance will not be valid because the offer terminated on Friday because there was a time frame stated in the offer for when you must accept by. So the offer has lapsed after Friday has ended. Now, the second one is also straightforward, but you have to you need more facts around it and it's a little bit more complicated. The offer might be silent? And if so, then you have to use a reasonable amount of time given the circumstances. Okay? Shelby, what's one of the material things that you like to buy? What's one of your favorite things to buy? Like a good clothes. Awesome. All right. Any particular brand you like? Huh?
I'm open to anything.
Open to anything. Don't tell me that. I'm gonna give you something crazy.
Okay.
Okay. All right, we won't go too crazy. Let's say Shelby is a huge fan of Abercrombie and Fitch, right? That's her favorite brand. She's like, oh God, not Abercrombie. So let's say you went to a convention at which there were a ton of different brands there, and it's a clothes convention, right, where they have the newest items for this season. And you go to the Abercrombie and Fitch booth at the beginning of the morning. You're the first person there, and they say, "Hey, you know what, Shelby? Since you are the first potential customer at our booth today here at this convention, we're gonna offer to give you 5 hoodies for a half off price if you buy as our first customer." And you're like, wow, that's a pretty good deal. And you know what though? Like, let me sit and think about it. I don't know if I want to spend that much on my first purchase this early. So what happens is you walk around the convention and then you ultimately get carried away and busy. You spend all your money at Gucci instead. And then you decide, you know what? I really want those hoodies. So you actually then go to the storefront a week later and then say, you know what? I accept that offer. 5 hoodies, half off. Here's the money. Let's go. Shelby, is there going to be a valid contract formed?
No.
And what's the strong argument as to why not?
Because I mean, I guess part of the offer was if I was the first one to buy it, so I guess that's kind of a condition, but that also somebody else bought it, so the reasonable time.
Let's pause there just for a quick second. And I like where you're going. You see the facts, but let's start from again. Now we're starting to argue, and then also too, if you can, come a little closer to the computer so I can hear you better. You want to think from the perspective of your folder system. How are you going to attack this? So again, we're asking if a valid contract is formed. Do you think a valid offer was made here?
Yes.
A valid offer was made, but the strong argument is going to be that that offer was
Conditional.
that we haven't used that word yet.
I know. Sorry. Well, there was a time frame.
So that offer, so the offer, remember, it has to go to something in your folder system. You're going to argue that that offer was terminated. And if that offer was terminated, it could not be accepted, and therefore there was no contract formed. So
When was it terminated?
So you want to say it was terminated at the convention when Shelby did not decide. So, and before we even get into when, you want to say that the offer was terminated by lapse. Then you want to get into the rule for lapse. Then you want to analyze the second rule that the offer was silent as to when it would, but there was a reasonable amount of time given the circumstances, and Shelby went past that time frame. So here, what would the reasonable amount of time have been to accept that offer, Shelby?
Until the first person bought stuff.
At the
Convention.
exactly. And when did you attempt to accept?
A week later at the storefront.
Exactly, right? So under these circumstances, this was not a reasonable time to accept. So therefore, you would argue that at the time that Shelby went to the storefront, that offer had lapsed. I mean, and it was even before then. You could say that the offer lapsed even if Shelby came at the end of the day and did it, the offer lapsed then, but definitely a week later at the storefront. So just a nice little hypo to give us the context. And so Shelby, and for everybody, this is where the folder system comes in. I want to make sure that you guys are getting rooted and seeing where your arguments are going, and you want to be rooted in the folder system. So again, just to start us off with that, my question to you, Shelby, was a valid contract formed? You correctly answered no. Then my next question to you is, what's going to be the strong argument for proving that a contract was not formed?
Because there was a termination due to lapse.
Exactly. So you're going to want to say that there was an offer made. However, that offer was terminated via lapse. Perfect. Let's move on to the next one, operation of law. An offer. Oh yeah, go for it.
So when it says if the offer is silent, I know that one was kind of specific because it said like you have to be the first person to buy and at the convention. But I don't know if I'm remembering right. Is there like a rule where it says like if it's something more general, there's like a 3 month period for a reasonable time?
That is what you're thinking to be the rule with a firm offer, which we'll get to in a second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but for lapse in particular, it can change. It's all given the context of the contract and what the parties are negotiating, etc. Cool. Um, okay, so next is operation of law. It's simple. An offer may be terminated by operation of law if one, death, the offeror dies before the offeree accepts, unless there was an option contract. We'll learn that more later, but look out for that little caveat. Or the offeree dies, right? So I offer to sell Nicole my laptop. I die the next day. She hadn't accepted yet. Well, the offer is terminated, right? Pretty straightforward. Unless there was an option contract. So if we created the contract on Monday, and in there, it was a valid option contract, which we'll learn later, that said that she had until Friday to accept. Even if I died during that week before she accepted on Friday, because there was an option contract that gave her the right to accept up until Friday, that would trump the operation of law death rule. Okay? So that's how that option contract works. The other one is the subject matter is destroyed or the illegality of the subject matter, right? So pretty straightforward stuff, rarely tested. You'll be able to get those questions easy, no problem. Next, revocation. The greatest. Remember, very important, often tested. Okay, my point person starting me off with this section is going to be Kareen. Okay, so Kareen, can you go ahead and read the general rule for revocation for us, please?
Revocation is the act of an offeror revoking, taking back his offer. An offer may be revoked by the offeror until the offeree has accepted. Revocation is effective once the offeree receives a direct or indirect revocation. If the offer is revoked, the offer is terminated and the offeree may no longer accept that offer to form a contract. The contract may only then be formed by creating a new offer. Some offers are irrevocable.
All right. And so what we see there is a lot of the concepts that we've already seen with termination as a whole. We're just now applying it to termination specifically. Once an offer is revoked, that means it's terminated, which means you can no longer accept it. The only way now a contract can be formed if it's a whole new offer that is then accepted. Real quick, Rosemary, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of the legality of the subject matter. Is it like
Uh,
with like matters or like
but-
everyday?
no. I was gonna say because I've moved on to revocation, and I should have asked any questions on the operation of law. Pause and hold on to that one for a second, and then just keep it. And then once we get to the end of termination, I'll answer that one. Okay, so back to revocation, right? That was our big picture. Kareen, we have two major sections. If you look at the teal sections in the blueprint, what are the two major sections for revocation?
How to revoke and irrevocable offers, can the offer even be revoked?
Exactly. So here's our big picture before we even get started. And it's that in revocation, you have two major questions, right? Was the offer properly revoked? And was the offer even revocable? Offer irrevocable. Those are your two major questions. Kareen, if the offer was irrevocable and the offer were properly revoked, are you ultimately going to have revocation?
Yes.
No. The offer was irrevocable and they properly revoked. So you can satisfy this rule of being proper, right? There's two ways to do it, direct or indirect. So you could have properly done one of these two things as far as communicating it and using a proper method. However, if the offer is labeled as an irrevocable offer, it doesn't matter if you properly do it, it's irrevocable. So then the answer there would be no. In order to have a proper revocation, it must, yes, be properly revoked, and it must be revocable. If it's irrevocable, it cannot be. But if it is revocable, but you don't properly revoke it, also grounds for no proper revocation. Straightforward, Kareem?
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think.
You think? We'll see.
Hypo will help.
Yes, we'll get into some hypos and see. So we're not going to go through the rules of proper revocation. I'm just going to tell you that there's direct revocation and there's indirect revocation, and then we'll go through the rules with our hypo. So let's skip over lapse. Let's skip over operation of law, and let's get to termination, how to revoke. And we have number one. Matt, you had a question before we get into the hypos?
Just for the purposes of studying this small section and when we analyze it, would you prefer us to do offers irrevocable first and then whether they properly revoke or vice versa?
Exactly. So this is going to be a legally fit extra breakdown, essentially, right? Most people in other programs are just going to have revocation, and then all of these rules are going to be essentially jumbled together. So what we're going to offer as a legally fit student on an essay doing this is just more clarity and more detail, and it just makes it easier for us to have the rules separated. So with that said, Matt, you really can go in either order, and it's whichever one feels more intuitive and natural for you. A lot of us, right, will think like, all right, I'm going to start with whether the offer is irrevocable because it just makes sense, and then get into whether it's properly done. But there's no, right, rhyme, or I've been saying rhyme or rhythm. They corrected me the other day and said it's rhyme or reason. But if you've watched Cool Runnings, feel the rhythm, feel the rhyme. Come on, guys, it's bobsled time. So there's no rhyme or rhythm as to like which way you got to do it. But, right, you can do this one first, second, right, doesn't matter. Feel the rhythm. Feel the rhyme. All right, number one, Kareen, go ahead and read number one for me, please.
Virgil is a photographer that is having a photo shoot on Friday. On the Monday before the shoot, he emails Betty a letter that says, I'd like to buy a Birkin bag from you. I need one for my photo shoot on Friday. Betty receives a letter on Wednesday, calls Virgil, and says, let me see if I have one. Virgil replies, you know what, forget about it. If you have to look for one, that means you don't have a good one. Has the offer been terminated? Yes?
And there's two options. Which option do you think it is? Direct or indirect?
Direct.
Yeah, this is pretty direct and straightforward, right? It was expressly communicated. He said, look, if you got to look for one, you ain't got a good one, I don't want to do it anymore. That's going to be the notion of a direct revocation, when the offeror is clearly communicating it to the offeree, okay? Now, I want everybody to take a look at the answer portion of this question in your hypo materials. And I want you to see from this point on, I'm going to start laying it out in this format where it's like offer, termination, acceptance, so you can clearly see it. And you want to get into the habit of that's how you're going to organize it yourself. And it makes it so much easier to analyze. So was there a valid offer here, Kareen?
Yes.
Yeah, there was, right? I'd like to buy a Birkin bag from you. That was a valid offer. That won't be the reason why this contract fails. But what will be, the next section is termination. And yes, by direct revocation. Okay? We haven't learned the rules of irrevocable offers yet, but you would conclude here that there are no facts to suggest that this offer is irrevocable. Plus, there was proper revocation, so therefore it is revoked. The acceptance is no longer valid, and there's no even facts of an attempted acceptance. All right, go ahead and read number two for us, Kareem.
Virgil is a photographer that is having a photo shoot on Friday. On the Monday before the shoot, he mails Betty a letter that says, I'd like to buy a Birkin bag from you. I need one for my photo shoot on Friday. Betty receives a letter on Wednesday, calls Virgil, and says, let me see if I have one. On Thursday, Betty is having lunch with her friend Jessica. He tells Betty that she just sold a Birkin bag to the same Virgil for $10,000. Thursday evening, Betty calls Virgil and says she accepts. Has the contract been formed?
Okay, so this is now, again, starting to get just a tad bit more difficult. Nothing too crazy yet. I'm going to erase this chart If you guys hadn't noticed already, you have this already in your material, so you can continue to follow along in this format with the chart. Now, Kareen, start us off. Can you please give me some reading comprehension? How does this fact pattern differ from the first one? Can you just give me some context? What's going on here with Virgil and Betty, right, and Jessica?
So everything was the same until Betty was having lunch with Jessica where she said she sold the bag.
Exactly. And from reading comprehension perspective, what's going on with Virgil, right? Like, right? Just give us some context. You know, he's a photographer. What's going on with him?
He has a shoot on Friday and wants a birthday.
Exactly. And it's like he wants one quick. He wants to, be done with it. And it appears as though he's like asking multiple people if he can get one. And essentially, when he called Betty, Betty did what? Or I'm sorry, when Betty received the letter, she called him. And how'd that conversation go?
She said that she would look to see if she had one.
Exactly. She was non-committal. She was kind of like, eh. And it appears, though, in that time, Virgil has gone out and gotten that bag from somebody else. Now, chronologically, what took place here? What was first?
So the letter was sent
And
to
that's
Betty.
and that's what? Analyzed as whether that's a proper...
Offer?
Exactly. So first we have whether that was a valid offer. Was that likely valid? Will it likely meet our 3-step test?
Yes.
Yeah, likely a valid offer. Then what happened next?
And then she received the letter on Wednesday.
Okay, so that's just when she received it. So she got the offer. Okay.
Okay, then they communicated and she said, let me check to see if I have one.
Does that amount to any contract, principle? Her saying, let me see if I have one?
No.
No. Okay. Keep going.
And then she met with her friend who said that she sold the bag to Virgil.
That might be analyzed as a possible what?
Revocation?
Possible, yes. Termination by revocation. So we'll come back to that when it's time to analyze to see if that's valid or not. What took place after that?
Acceptance of the offer
Right.
by Betty.
After she heard that, then she called and tried to accept. So then there was attempted acceptance. Perfect. So again, now we have our order of operation, but now the ultimate answer is going to come down to whether each thing was valid. I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit and analyzed one of them already, but in theory, when you guys are getting situated with these complex questions, what you can do is first get organized by just laying it out in chronological order. Then you can actually go in and analyze and see what was valid and what was invalid. So, offer was valid. Kareen, do you think this is going to be a valid termination by revocation?
No.
Okay, why not?
Well, it could be indirect revocation because she received accurate information. If it is, there's no detail to be sure whether or not it was accurate. But it was from her friend, which has no reason to lie to her. So from a reliable source.
Exactly. So let's be clear. Let's run through each element. So there is indirect revocation, guys, where it doesn't have to come directly from the offeror, which would here be Virgil, if the following elements are met. Received accurate information. Is there any facts that suggest that this information is inaccurate?
No.
No, right? So we can believe, okay, this is accurate. Is this a reliable source? To the points that you made, Kareen, this is her friend. There's no reason to believe that she's lying. This is an adult. It's not like some little kid walking around like, hey, Virgil sold his bag. It's the best friend saying, hey, I sold the bag to him for this photo shoot. She's aware of that he needs one for this photo shoot. Reliable source. And then 3, it's information that the offeror has taken action in a way that a reasonable person would believe the offer has been revoked. Can you analyze as to why this information should be taken in a way that he no longer intends to contract with Betty?
Because he got the bag that was necessary for Friday, and now that Betty knows she wouldn't need to give him the bag.
Okay, can you come up with the counter argument there? Do you see the counter argument?
Is it that maybe that she doesn't know if he needs more than one?
Exactly. A reasonable person would not deem this to be information that he no longer wants to contract with me because maybe he wanted more than one Birkin bag, right? So that's all. Like, you almost always have a counter argument for indirect revocation, guys. But right under the context, him saying, "I want to buy a Birkin bag from you." I just sold a Birkin bag to the same Virgil for $10,000. You can really go both ways on this. So this is not going to be a for sure yes, as you know, typically your conclusions will be with a reasonable person standard. Sometimes it will be slam dunk, but you can oftentimes do a likely conclusion. So you would make your arguments on both sides. I personally would conclude that this was enough for a reasonable person to believe that this is inconsistent with an offer still being made to Betty. So I'm going to conclude that this was proper by indirect. There are no facts to suggest that this was irrevocable, so it was revocable. Therefore, this was a valid termination. And immediately we know, Karine, that if this is a valid termination, that means this acceptance was
It was invalid.
invalid because it's not timely. However, if somebody were to conclude the other way and say that this termination by revocation was invalid, well, then that would make this acceptance valid. Okay? So, again, nice little first lesson for our newcomers that didn't do early bar prep, and it's the reminder that the points are in the analysis, not in the conclusion. On a given essay, right, because we know we all have to have the same one right answer on an MBE. On the essay, though, right, it's about the arguments and knowing where you could argue both sides and where the conclusion doesn't really matter. But I'll tell you, on many essays on both sample answer 1 and sample answer 2, right, you compare the two and they'll have different conclusions as to some of these major issues. But it's only when it's intentionally made to be gray. You cannot have different conclusions when it's a slam dunk analysis. So this would be something that you could argue both sides, right? It doesn't matter. But as long as you're making those arguments that Kareem did so well. We are now ready to move on in our materials. We have now finished revocation, specifically the question on how to properly revoke. Kareem, what's the next section that we're going to cover?
Irrevocable offers?
Exactly, because that's the two-step, right, question to termination by revocation as a whole. Was proper revocation and was it revocable to begin with? There are 4 different ways for an offer to be irrevocable. What are those 4 different ways?
Traditional option contract, firm offer 2205, unilateral contract, and detrimental reliance.
Okay, so those are our 4. Which party is going to be arguing irrevocable offer? So let's make sure we're being grounded with this and we can kind of work our way up and see what's going on. Who wants to argue that the offer was irrevocable?
The plaintiff.
Right? Good. Typically the plaintiff. Because if the offer was irrevocable, that means what, Karine?
Then there was a termination of the contract.
No. If the offer was irrevocable, and the plaintiff doesn't want the contract to be terminated, if the offer was irrevocable, then that means there was no termination by revocation, making it likely that there was no termination at all. If there's no termination at all, that makes it more likely that
the contract stands.
Exactly. Good. So this is also how you use the folder system to kind of see who's arguing what, and you work your way up. Clarence, question?
Yeah, maybe it's just a terminology thing, but would it always be the plaintiff? Wouldn't it just be whoever the offeree was?
Whoever the
Because
offer what?
The offeree, because they were saying it was irrevocable. They would want it to be irrevocable because when you say plaintiff, because it could be, I just get confused sometimes because it's so many different.
Exactly. So to your point, it's really hard to make it absolute whether you're using plaintiff or offeree. So in the context, when I'm breaking it down in this way, I'm happy you asked that question. I'm assuming the very basic context of a situation where plaintiff is suing defendant for breach of contract, and in theory, it doesn't matter if I was the original offeror or offeree, but I'm the one saying that a contract was formed and you didn't perform. And so I'm using all the principles to essentially show it should go through, and then the defendant is trying to avoid. But to Clarence's point, there are times when the offeree is trying to get out of the contract. There are times when the offeror is trying to get out of the contract. There's times where the parties are suing each other for a breach of contract, and then obviously it gets a little crazier there. So again, as we're kind of building up to these more complex questions, we are operating under the context that the plaintiff, whether it's the offeror or offeree, is the one that's arguing breach of contract on behalf of the other party. Cool. Okay, so we have irrevocable offers. And so the first one, oh, but before we get into it, Kareem, if you are the party trying to argue that the offer was irrevocable, in theory, do you have a personal preference or do you care which of these four that you use or no?
No.
In theory, you don't. We need to realize that these four are four different bullets in the gun of irrevocable offers, right? It doesn't matter which bullet hits. You just want to try any one of them if right applicable. So keep that in mind that all of these have the same value. Traditional option contract has the same value of firm offer 2205, of unilateral contract, etc. Okay. So let's jump into each one. The first one is traditional option contract. What's the elements tell us that we need? Let's switch this up and let's go with Yachty. Little Yachty. So what are the two elements for a traditional option contract?
So a promise to hold the offer open, and the offerer receives additional KSN for holding the offer. I don't know what KSN is.
Yeah, that's going to be consideration. So that's going to be short. So whenever we see KSN in the future, that's short for consideration. And so, yeah, we need a promise to hold the offer open. That's very simple. Hey, Yachty, I want to sell you my iPad right here that I'm teaching off of. I will hold this offer open for you until the end of bar prep. You have all the time between now and then to decide, right? In return, you give me $5 or whatever it may be. Boom. I cannot revoke that offer now until the end of bar prep. So that's how traditional option contract works. Let's go ahead and everybody, let's go to the hypos real quick. And let's go ahead and do number one. Joe offers to sell Elizabeth his car. Again, Yachty, we can start to organize our fact pattern as we go. What's the first thing now that's taken place?
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out which hypo we're on.
Termination, revocation, traditional option contract. And if you need to, take a second and find it. Let's get it going though with Matt.
Joe offers to sell Elizabeth his car.
So if we're going, and my question was, Matt, just off of that first sentence, again, we can start to label this as we go. So the first thing was?
Well, sir, we have a valid offer.
Okay, so we have a valid offer. Cool, you want to go ahead and say it's valid? Yep, no need to analyze that. Then what's the next sentence?
Elizabeth tells Joe she's not sure if she can pull the money together to buy it. So that sentence there was no acceptance right there.
Exactly. You can write that down in your notes. Not necessarily here, but yep, there was no acceptance. Okay, next.
Joe tells Elizabeth, I'll hold the offer open for you until Friday.
Okay, so now we have in the offer a potential option contract. Okay.
On Thursday, Joe sells it to Aaron. On Friday, Elizabeth calls Joe and properly accepts. Is Elizabeth entitled to damages?
All right. We're going to analyze this whole Thursday sells it to Joe as possible.
Possible option contract.
No, not the selling it to, I'm sorry, sell it to Joe.
Selling it, sorry, a possible revocation.
Yeah, on Thursday, selling it to Joe, selling it to Aaron. Exactly. So there's a possible revocation here or termination. by revocation. And then Elizabeth calls Joe and properly accepts. Okay, so then we have a possible acceptance here. Now, real quick, before we get into the actual step by step, again, I told everybody in orientation, for those that didn't catch it, you have to give your initial gut feeling and thought to a fact pattern so you can assess what your gut feeling is. So back to Francesca, that's how you do gauge setting, is that when you see something like this, you need to figure out what's my initial gut feeling as to the outcome here. So then that way you can either confirm that gut feeling or change that gut feeling if it was wrong. So really quickly, Matt, what is your gut feeling? Do you think that Elizabeth is going to be entitled to damages?
I believe she will be.
You believe she will be? Now we're going to go through this fact pattern and see if that's the case. So the first thing that we have here is draft an intro for this question. Now hopefully you haven't looked at the sample answer for this yet. And can you attempt to articulate an intro? And again, your intro typically wants to come directly from the call of the question.
Sure. I suppose first we would start with applicable law.
Well, what I'm looking for you to form is kind of like a paragraph, right? And a sentences, right?
In order for Elizabeth to recover damages, she would need to prove that there was a valid offer and a valid acceptance, which would make an enforceable contract.
There we go. So now we're kind of getting in the realm of what it should look like. Let's look at the intro that I wrote. To determine whether Elizabeth is entitled to damages, we ask if the parties entered into a valid and enforceable contract. Elizabeth will argue that a contract was formed when she accepted on Friday. Joe will argue that there was no contract formation because the offer was terminated before acceptance. So Matt, and again, Mark being now my go-to intro guy. We got Shane as my folder system guy and Marcus my intro guy. What we're seeing here is that what you can include in your intro are the main arguments of the parties regarding the situation. Here we have Elizabeth's main arguments is that contract was formed when she accepted on Friday. Joe will argue that no contract formation because the offer was terminated. So there's an example of an intro. There's no like you have to have this in your intro. You just want to get into the comfort, right, of doing so and knowing how to flow from the call of the question. But nothing was wrong with Matt's either. Mine's a little bit more detailed, and it just kind of gives, in my opinion, the reader a little bit more assurance of what's coming next is going to be, right, A1, money. So let's go to number 2 now. Outline how you would attack this on an essay. So that's essentially going to kind of flow from this. So everybody just go ahead and again, try not to look, if you haven't already, at the sample answer. Take a minute to see if this was an essay and you had to organize your headings, how you would do such. So I'm going to give you guys a minute, look at the fact pattern, right? And try to organize your headings as you would if you were outlining this essay.
DeAndre,
Yep.
should we like operate and outline this based on the presumption that there was like separate consideration for the traditional option K?
Well, you want to outline it in a way where you know that's something you have to analyze. So it's just a matter of like where does that conversation go? So
Okay.
you want to have a generic outline that will include a discussion of that in the appropriate place.
Okay.
Okay, let's stop there because it should be a pretty straightforward outline. Matt, what did you have? Can you tell me what order?
Yeah, I just went offer, if there's a termination, acceptance. Well, based on what we've covered so far in class, but
Exactly.
you'd have to add duration later.
Okay, now let's go ahead now and look again at the sample answer because I went ahead and included an outline for you. So this is a judgment call. If you wanted to have something that bare bones, you definitely could, Matt. each student is going to differ as to what level of detail. To Louis' question, me knowing that this is going to be a really focus on this option contract, I kind of want to spend a little time from this big picture perspective, maybe seeing now how that's going to look and be organized. So the only difference between mine and yours is that I went ahead and added a little further detail that I am going to be talking about termination by revocation. And within revocation, I'm going to be talking both about the question, was the offer irrevocable? And within that, I'm going to be talking about traditional option contract. And then I'm also going to be asking the question of, was it properly done? Properly revoked. And then I have to talk about acceptance. No big deal there. No need to further outline here. And then I have to also analyze consideration because that's also needed, right, for a valid contract. So this is the art of outlining again. You can do it to whatever level of detail, but again, if you're identifying a prioritized topic, you want to go ahead and give it some detail. We got some questions popping up on this, so let's do them one at a time. Mark?
Yeah, so for some reason, I'm seeing that if I were to talk about revocation, then proper revocation under it, whether it was direct or indirect, and then talk about whether it was irrevocable, and then under that heading, like switch those two around. Is that okay, or?
All right, you better be paying attention, man, because that was exactly whose question was that? I think it was Matt's question. He asked, the order of these two, does it matter? And so, no, it does not matter. And so, to answer that question again, Mark, you can switch those. If you want to do proper revocation first, then do was it irrevocable? You can totally do that.
Oh, okay, I didn't notice you asked that.
All good, all good. And then next one is Ani.
I had the option contract under offer.
So
Can you
you
do it like that?
absolutely not. Because when you get to offer, you just want to do the general rule. That's what you're focused on there. And you're just saying, like, did I start with offer to begin with? And there you're going to just be analyzing the original facts around offering to sell the car. Traditional option contract is going to be a completely different concept analyzed within revocation. So yes, or no, you do not want to talk about option contracts at all ever in the offer. The only reason why I put it here was more so for like the timeline, because when you're looking at it, the option contract is typically made at the same time the offer is made. So those facts will kind of like
Which is why I had it there.
exactly. But based off of how it makes sense to see what takes place, right? You would be analyzing here whether it was irrevocable. But again, irrevocable doesn't come up until you're talking about termination. So that's why it would then be out of place.
Yeah. My thought process was explaining the fact that it was an offer via option contract, and then under revocation saying, well, because it's an option contract, it can't be revoked.
Yeah, so you want to change that mentality because you don't want to think about it as now the option contract is the label of the entire contract. It's a pretty interesting name to give it because it really is like you have the offer, and then within the offer, you're creating, maybe turning it into an option contract, but don't get too caught up in the labeling. You have to have your original offer, which is like the main deal, and then within that offer and that main deal, you have an option as to when you can accept.
But you can't sub-issue option contract under offer.
Well, look, at the end of the day, you can do whatever it is that you want to do as far as organization. It's just a matter of like what's going to flow the easiest and what's going to be something that's normal for a grader to see. And what I can tell you, Ani, is going through all the California sample answers, analyzing option contract at the very beginning of your essay when you're doing offer is just not something that's common.
Okay.
Yeah. Next one, Lily.
Sorry, I'm just a little bit confused still. So in the offer section, we talk about the original offer, and then do we bring up how there was like no acceptance to that offer as well? And then go into the option contract under revocation.
So if we're looking at, yeah, I can give you like the gist of what each section of our outline we'll talk about. So the first section is the offer. I'll simply be talking about the offer to sell Elizabeth the car. Joe's the offeror, Elizabeth's the offeree. It's an offer to sell the car. Under these facts, right, it appears as a valid offer. This is a question not focusing on it. In a real fact pattern, you would want some more detail, like how much money was it selling for and things of that sort. But for the sake of like this question, we're not focused on it. We're just going to assume it was a valid offer. It says offers to sell Elizabeth his car. Then we get into termination. We're going to see if that offer was terminated, because if so, there is no contract form. And then within termination is when we're talking about, was it proper and was it even revocable to begin with? Then after that, we're going to talk about acceptance. And then the acceptance analysis is going to be dictated by whether or not revocation was valid. So maybe, Lily, what might be confusing you is that no matter what the order of operation taken by the parties was, you're going to ultimately want to analyze in the flow of the folder system, right, and of your blueprint, because that's kind of like the steps that you go through. In theory, like if you wanted to switch up acceptance and do that one first before revocation, you could. But just so I can have a method and a system, I always just stick to the blueprint. And so even if this was invalid, I'm going to talk about this first and then talk about acceptance, because it makes it easier for me to talk about acceptance. If I were to switch it around and do acceptance first, I'd have to say, all right, acceptance. Well, my acceptance analysis is dependent on whether or not this was properly terminated, then have to do proper termination, then refer back to acceptance. Is that making it a little clearer for you?
That's clear, thank you.
Awesome. All right, next, Louis.
So this is just something looking at like the sample outline that you had like in the answer for the hypo. So under like the last part where you go through the conclusions of everything, where it says was offer irrevocable, it says yes on there. I just wanted to clarify if that was a typo or anything along that lines.
Got you. Well, let's
was revocable, right?
let's hold off on that section just because we haven't gotten there yet, because I want to go through the actual analysis. And was the offer irrevocable? Yeah, let's get to it, but it looks like the answer to that might be no. But yeah, we're going to go through the actual analysis here in a second. Yep. And then Natasha, you had a question?
So an issue sometimes I have is like under under termination, I have this weird thing where I have to go through all 4 of the sections and like write a definition and write like last doesn't apply here because da 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 da.
No.
Operation, right? Completely don't do that, right?
Yeah.
But whatever I think the right answer is, analyze it, and then show every single section.
It's gonna vary. It's so many factors to determine, again, when do you raise and dismiss and when do you not. So what you're gonna have to know is that throughout bar prep, you're gonna have to focus on that and see, based off of sample answers, based off of the things that we give you, when are the times you do it and when are the times you don't. Under this fact pattern, right, it's not a full essay, but considering there's a lot more things to talk about, right, you wouldn't need to go through lapse and operation by law. You would just go straight to termination by revocation.
Like there's no extra points there that I would be losing by now.
Exactly. But it just depends. Like if sometimes you have an in-depth analysis and there are not a lot of things to talk about, you do more of this like you raise and dismiss thing. So again, it's all relative. We'll focus on that.
Right now, this one you go straight into.
Exactly. Okay, you're welcome. So let's go back to Matt and let's actually work through the analysis here. So first thing we have to analyze is whether there was a valid offer. So is that going to be a valid offer, Matt?
Yeah.
Under these facts.
That'll just be a slam dunk because, as we said in the fact pattern, it just says Joe offers to sell the car.
Exactly. And we're not going to go any deeper. You would want to say, like, assuming there was a price included. But even if there's no price, remember, gap fillers, right, will put it in for a UCC contract. All right, moving on. Next thing we're going to analyze is termination. Which one do you want to do first? Do you want to do whether the offer was irrevocable, or do you want to do proper revocation first?
Personally, I like seeing if it's irrevocable first.
Perfect. So let's go through the rules, and you tell me if it is.
Under this one, we would be asking if there's a traditional option contract. In order for Elizabeth defined that there was a traditional option contract, there would need to be a promise to hold the offer open, and Joe would need to receive additional consideration for holding the offer open. As per the facts, he says he'll open up till Friday, so there is a promise to hold it open, but the facts do not indicate that Elizabeth gave any additional consideration for Joe to keep it open till Friday.
Okay, so the answer to the question of was a traditional option contract created, the answer to that is
No.
no. We haven't learned any of the other principles of irrevocable offers yet. So for now, we're just going to assume that no other irrevocable offer concept is met. So there is no traditional option contract. And yeah, so to Louis' point, everybody, there was a small typo there for revocation. Was the offer irrevocable? That should say no, because there is no traditional option contract, which means then the offer is not irrevocable by means of one. So the answer there is no. Everything else appears, though, to be correct because it still was not properly revoked. So that's getting into the next question is, was it properly revoked?
In order for an offer to be revoked, you can either have direct revocation or indirect revocation. The facts do not indicate that Joe expressly revocated the contract to Elizabeth. In addition, there was no indirect revocation because Elizabeth did not receive any accurate information from a reliable source that Joe sold the car to Aaron.
Absolutely perfect. You know what facts are going there. It's the fact that Joe sold it to Aaron. However, the elements are not met because there are no facts to show that Elizabeth received information of this sale to another person. So there were no facts of proper revocation here. So you have no proper revocation and you had a revocable offer. So it was revocable, but it wasn't properly done. So what's the ultimate conclusion on termination by revocation?
That there was no termination.
That there was no termination.
Termination of the offer by Joe to Elizabeth.
Exactly. So then when we get to acceptance, it should flow pretty straightforward. What's the attempted acceptance?
Attempted acceptance was when on Friday Elizabeth called Joe.
Okay. That appears to be valid or invalid?
That appears to be valid.
Exactly. And then consideration, right? For these questions right now, we're just assuming consideration is met, and it would be Joe would be receiving some money and Elizabeth would be receiving the car. So what's the ultimate conclusion? Is Elizabeth entitled to damages?
Elizabeth would be entitled to damages because there was an enforceable contract.
Exactly. And Joe breached that contract.
And Joe breached that contract.
Perfect. Okay. Any questions on this hypo that we just did? Yes, Ani.
Sorry, just to clarify, I don't know if I heard revocable or irrevocable. Did we say that it was irrevocable or revocable?
So there was no traditional option contract. There was no theory met to make it irrevocable. So that means it was revocable.
So the fact that he said I'll hold it open until Friday
had essentially no effect because the other steps weren't created. So what could have made this a proper traditional option contract? If in exchange for that promise, Elizabeth had given him $10. But what this question was really testing you on, guys, was making sure you're analyzing everything properly, because the idea was that this was actually revocable by Joe. However, he never properly did it, nor was there indirect revocation. So even though it was revocable, you still have to properly do it, which here he failed to do so because he didn't communicate it directly to Elizabeth, nor did a reliable source communicate that to Elizabeth. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there just wasn't other facts regarding if it was irrevocable or not.
Exactly. And then there's no
No further facts, okay.
Exactly. So there's no facts to prove traditional option. And again, this is not going to be a firm offer, unilateral, or detrimental reliance. None of those are here on these facts. So it is revocable.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So that appears to answer all the questions. So now we can move on. Again, one more time, just to make sure that that was clear. This question was giving you a situation where it was revocable. Why was it revocable? Because there was no option contract, because the elements weren't met, and right now we're saying that there was also no firm offer, no unilateral rule, and no detrimental reliance rule. So ultimately, it would be revocable. Okay, so that's great for Joe. In theory, maybe some of us might have just been like, okay, so then yeah, it was revoked. However, you have to still properly revoke. And there, that just did not happen. There was no direct or indirect revocation. So therefore, there was no proper revocation. There was no revocation at all, no termination by revocation, right? And then that allowed our analysis to flow. Before we move on page 23, let's look at the fact variation. And Lily, I want to walk through this one with you. So it says, same facts plus Joe immediately called Elizabeth after selling to Aaron and told her that the offer is off the table.
Sorry, I can't find where it is.
And
Page 20.
Page 23?
The blueprint?
No, in the hypos.
I think it's actually page 9. It's page 9.
Why is
For us,
mine?
it's page 9.
Oh, I have a different. I'm so sorry about that. I have the professor version. You guys have the teacher version. My bad. So yeah, page 9. Yeah, the teacher version.
The fact piece?
So the fact variation is. Now, what page am I on? There we go. The fact variation is same facts plus Joe immediately calls Elizabeth after selling to Aaron and told her that the offer is off the table. Does that change anything as to it being a revocable offer?
No, because there still isn't any additional consideration.
Perfect. Exactly. Right on the money. So this is still now revocable. That's good for Joe. Does it change anything with proper revocation?
It could be a direct revocation.
Yeah, I mean, that even could be. Joe immediately called Elizabeth after selling it to Aaron and told her that the offer is off the table. That is now going to be a direct revocation, which means it was revocable. Yes, it was properly done. So that means the offer was terminated. If the offer was terminated, then that means no contract was formed and the acceptance was invalid, right? So that was one little change to make the whole fact pattern different. Now let's do one more. Go ahead and read the second fact variation for me, Lily.
Same facts, plus when Joe made the offer, Elizabeth gave Joe $5 for holding the offer open, and Joe calls Elizabeth and revokes the offer. So we did create a traditional option contract now because she gave him that $5, which is amounted to additional consideration.
So now there is an option contract, which makes this offer irrevocable until Friday. Was there proper revocation?
Well, it depends when Joe called Elizabeth.
And it'll still be immediately after selling it, and I think he sold it on Thursday. Yeah, on Thursday, Joe sells it to Aaron. So he still did it, and on Thursday, he called and told her. So under the definition of properly revoke, this is still going to be direct revocation. So he did properly do it by doing it directly. However, he properly revoked, and again, I can see how the wordplay might throw you off, but it's like, did you do the right form or the right method properly? Yes, but the offer was irrevocable under these facts because there was a traditional option contract. Therefore, what's the outcome there, Lily?
Therefore, a contract was formed and Elizabeth is entitled to damages.
Exactly. And work your way up though. And I think that's why you kind of end it with like a little hesitation. So because this was the case, the offer was not terminated, which means the offer was validly accepted, which means we have a contract because there's also consideration. And yes, she's entitled to damages for his breach. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully we all have that down. We'll do one last question, and then we'll get to the next irrevocable offer section. That's firm offer. Ani, one last one.